Across the Threshold, Chapter 17 from the book Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Phenomenon by Violet Tweedale, published in 1919. Once upon a time I had an interesting experience showing how often one may be in the presence of the disembodied without being in the least aware of the fact. It was a bright, cold day in October with a biting wind and brilliant sunshine. About midday I was walking up a long avenue leading to a great house. On either side of me, for a mile or so, lay flat, open grass country, pasturages full of grazing cattle. The trees bordering the avenue stood at about 30 feet apart. They were gigantic beeches of considerable age. Their silvery trunks of wide girth were smooth and straight, and in no way impeded the view on all sides. The avenue was wide and straight and bordered by grass out of which the trees sprang. As I turned in at the lodge gate, I noticed, without any particular interest, a woman walking in front of me, but in a very few moments I began to pay more attention to her obvious peculiarities. She was about 25 to 30 feet ahead of me, moving in the same direction, and the view I had of her back began to puzzle me. On that decidedly chilly morning she wore a white muslin dress, a material never used out of doors, even in summer in that northern clime. Over her shoulders floated something mauve and flimsy, and on her head was what looked like an old-fashioned poke-bonnet. Her back looked young, and yet she was a creature of a bygone century, and knowing everyone within a 20-mile radius of where I walked, I speculated as to who she could possibly be. Perhaps what puzzled me most was how she had managed to avoid the attention of the village children, who would at once have been alive to the novelty of her whole appearance. I looked forward to hearing all about her at the big house, and, as seemed highly probable, meeting her face to face and obtaining an introduction to her. Then it suddenly occurred to me to overtake her and pass her. We were both walking very slowly. I at once quickened my steps, but somehow I never seemed to gain on her. Even this did not rouse in me the faintest suspicion of being in the presence of a disembodied soul. It merely sharpened my curiosity and urged me to greater efforts. I moved from the road to the grass, which I calculated would deaden the sound of my footsteps. Then I began to run. Still no success. The lady never turned her head to right or left, but was clearly aware of my pursuit, for apparently without the least effort she kept her distance from me. At the moment when I was feeling rather baffled and very much puzzled, I caught sight of my friend N in the distance coming to meet me. Ah, I thought, as I at once slowed down to draw breath, she will have to pass her, and she'll tell me what her face is like. I kept eyes and attention closely fixed on the two figures as they drew nearer and nearer to one another. Now the stranger appeared to be exactly at an equal distance between us, when, lo, she simply vanished, as utterly and entirely as the electric light one switches off in a room. 1 second there she was, perfectly and clearly visible. The next second there she was not. I looked foolishly around, though I knew that neither to the right or left was there any hiding place. Moreover, my eyes had been fully upon her when she vanished, flicked out. How well I remember N running up to me, and without any greeting, we both simultaneously burst out, "Did you see her?" N told me that the inside of the poke-bonnet was empty. The lady had no face. Of course we gazed around and searched behind the boles of the trees, but we were both aware how foolish any such proceeding was, for we had both been staring hard at her when she disappeared. There was a bygone tragedy connected with that part of the avenue, but on discussing the matter with the owner of the great house, we all had to come reluctantly to the conclusion that the woman we had seen had no connection with that story. The former Lady Dalrymple had been murdered by one of her servants in the avenue about 100 years previously, but the portraits of the deceased and the lady we had seen here bore not the smallest resemblance. It was said that Lady Dalrymple walked, a tall, massive figure clad in a dark, heavy cloak sprinkled with snow. She had been done to death one January night in a snowstorm which had hidden her remains for several days. The apparition we had seen was that of a very slender girl or a young woman. The interesting fact that I wish to emphasize is that had this young drama in muslin turned aside, slipped through the light fence, and struck off across the fields, it would never have occurred to either N or me that she was not physical. We would have speculated as to who she was, but out of common civility we would not have followed her. We would have made casual inquiries as to who she was, simply out of curiosity aroused by her peculiar attire, and then the trifling incident would have been forgotten. That sudden vanishing has rooted the experience firmly in my mind, and I have long since become convinced that the little story I have just told is an extremely common one. I believe such disembodied spirits are constantly with us, and that many of us see them, pass them in the streets, stand beside them in crowds, and accept them perfectly naturally as physical entities, in no way different from what we are ourselves. Many people believe that our faculties have a limit beyond which we cannot go, but this is certainly not so, as it is now proved that some people have the X-ray sight by nature and can see far more than others. This faculty has nothing to do with keenness of sight. It is a question of sight which is able to respond to different series of vibrations. Undoubtedly, there are many entities about us who do not reflect rays of light that we can see, yet who may reflect those other rays of rates of vibration which can be photographed. It is extremely difficult for the average person to grasp the reality of that which we cannot see with our physical eyes, and to realize how very partial our sight is. Yet science continually demonstrates to us worlds of teeming life, of whose very existence we should be ignorant so far as our senses are concerned. What ought clearly to be grasped is the fact that we are not separated from the so-called dead, save by the limitation of our consciences. We have not lost those gone before. We have only lost the power to see them, and very occasionally that power is restored to us by what means we know not. All visible things are the result of invisible causes, and doubtless those denizens of the subtler worlds come amongst us with a distinct purpose in view. Sometimes that purpose can be traced to remorse, revenge, a quest, a strong attraction to the scene of a crime, but in many other cases no object can be discerned. The condition of the observer is constantly found to be absolutely normal. The mental conditions of both myself and N were, as far as we could tell, quite normal. Our mental activity was no greater, no more vivid, and no more accurate than usual, yet we both saw an object that was beyond normal sense and rational vision. The fact that so often there is no connecting link between the apparition and his or her surroundings induces me to believe that we are everywhere surrounded by the denizens of the other world, and on rare occasions we catch a glimpse of them. Here is another utterly trivial story which emphasizes the above suggestion. I was lunching with my husband in a house built within the last 50 years. The only former occupants were known to us. We were discussing a letter I had that morning received, and I said, "I'll go and fetch it for you to read." I rose and left the dining room and pushed open the half-closed door of the adjoining drawing-room. What was my astonishment to behold, standing in the middle of the floor, a tall, dark man, a total stranger. He stood exactly between the door and a large bow window, through which poured a flood of sunshine, and I paused involuntarily and stared at him. Not that there was anything the least peculiar about him, and indeed his air of great respectability instantly banished the flashing thought of burglar. The stranger returned my stare with perfect composure, and in a second or two, during which we regarded each other, I had time to observe his appearance. He was well dressed, all in black, with a modern black broadcloth frock-coat buttoned close. He was very tall and strongly built. His face was sallow and heavy-featured, and he wore a short black beard. I bowed and addressed him. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was waiting. Do you wish to see me or my husband?" I said politely. The man made no reply, but at once began to glide, not walk, towards the closed glass door leading to a conservatory on the left. His eyes never left mine. Without opening the door, he passed through it and vanished. Then I realized and darted after him, throwing open the door and staring beyond. Nothing. Nothing physical could have passed through a glass door without shattering it, and that is all there is to this story. The man had no connection with us, nor, so far as we could learn, with the former occupants of the house. A very old friend of mine, Mrs. Sinclair, wife of the late Sir Tolemach Sinclair's second son, told me of an experience she and her mother once had when visiting a cousin, Major Featherstone Dilkey, of Maxstoke Castle, Warwickshire. The castle is ancient and surrounded by a moat, and within the moat lies a tennis court. In order to reach their rooms on the ground floor, Mrs. Sinclair and her mother had to pass through a great stone hall filled with fine old oak and armor. Beyond that, their way lay through the remains of an old chapel, which once had been extensively damaged by fire. One evening, after playing tennis till rather late, Mrs. Sinclair and her mother hastened indoors to change for dinner. As they passed through the chapel, Mrs. Sinclair saw her mother suddenly shrink back against the wall. At the same time she exclaimed, "Oh, May, stand aside and let that person pass." Mrs. Sinclair looked around, but could see no one. Again her mother cried out insistently, "Oh, do let her pass." "But no one is here," Mrs. Sinclair assured her. Then, seeing that her mother looked terrified, she took her by the arm and hurried her to their rooms. When the door was shut, Mrs. Sinclair tried to soothe her mother's agitation and asked her what she had seen and why she was so disturbed. Her mother replied, "There was a young woman in the corner who was trying hard to escape observation, and the sight of her gave me the most uncomfortable feeling. She was not a maidservant, and wore no cap. She was dressed in a mauve print gown with a violet sprig upon it. She might have been a needlewoman." Mrs. Sinclair calmed her mother as well as she could, and they went down to dinner together. During the meal, what was her horror to hear her mother say to their host, "Oh, William, I feel sure there are ghosts in the castle. I've seen one tonight." There was a most uncomfortable silence after this, and Major Featherstone Dilkey looked terribly agitated. After dinner, when the ladies were alone in the drawing-room, Mrs. Dilkey asked Mrs. Sinclair what they had seen, and on being told, she explained that before a death in the family, a certain housekeeper who had been murdered always haunted the chapel, and in consequence of this warning always coming true, her husband was exceedingly nervous of this apparition. Nothing more was said upon the subject during Mrs. Sinclair's stay, but before the end of the year, Major Featherstone Dilkey lay dead. Such warnings are very common and very hard to understand. They suggest that the apparition knows of the approaching death of a certain person, and that it has the power to make itself visible to certain persons at certain times. Why this warning should be given is a baffling mystery. Again, why did not Mrs. Sinclair see this ghost when her mother so plainly saw it? The fact is that all sorts of most unlikely persons see apparitions, even the rankest unbeliever and the most matter-of-fact individual, and they generally see them at the most unexpected moments. I remember one day walking along a country road and seeing a dog-cart in the distance coming towards me. As it drew nearer, I saw that it contained the late Lord Weymouth, and on recognizing me, he drew up and jumped down. "I've got a confession to make to you," he said. "I wouldn't tell anyone else for the world. I'd have the life chafed out of me. I've actually seen a ghost." "I'm not in the least surprised. Why shouldn't you see a ghost?" I retorted. "Well, I never believed in them, and I didn't think I was the sort of man who'd ever see one. Now, if it had been Arthur Balfour, there would have been nothing in it. He's a member of the Psychical Society and all that sort of thing." "But being a member of the Psychical Society does not predispose one to see ghosts," I expostulated, but Lord Weymouth remained very puzzled. He told me that when about half a mile from his own front door at Gosford, East Lothian, he saw a man walking in front of him in the same direction, going towards the house. In a vague sort of way, he wondered for a moment where this man had suddenly sprung from, as he had not noticed him before, but there was nothing unusual in his appearance to rouse curiosity. He was a stranger and looked like a foreman in his Sunday clothes. Lord Wemyss walked on, always keeping about 10 yards between himself and the stranger. At a certain point he fully expected he would strike off by a path leading to the servants' and tradesmen's entrance, but rather to his surprise the man did no such thing. He pursued an undeviating course towards the main entrance, and on observing Lord Wemyss became more interested and looked at him more closely. Still, there was something remarkable to be observed, and concluding that the man, being a stranger, did not know of any other entrance, he quickened his steps in order to come up with him. In this he failed. The man kept his distance, and just as he reached the door, he vanished from sight. I tried hard to persuade Lord Wemyss to tell this story to Mr. Balfour, who was so intimate a friend, but I believe he never did so. The interest lies in the long time during a half-mile walk in which the ghost was under observation, also in the fact that until the man disappeared on the doorstep, Lord Wemyss had never suspected that the stranger was other than ordinary flesh and blood. So many people have confided their ghost stories to me and swore me to secrecy that I am convinced such experiences are very common and only remain hidden either from fear of being laughed at or from being thought to suffer from hallucinations. End of Across the Threshold by Violet Tweedale.